Welcome to Beyond the Limits with me, Mike Forsyth.
And me, Matt Clark. Hi, Mike. Nice to see you again. How have you been? Sorry and commiserations about Nottingham Forest losing yesterday. Must have been pretty tough for you.
Yeah, good to see you, Matt. For context, we were meant to be recording last night, but I went to see my football team play at Wembley, and it didn't end up with the result that I hoped. So, focusing on podcasting was the last thing on my mind, unfortunately. But I'm back on it today and excited to be talking about creatine. It's a topic that we get asked a lot about in medicine, but it's also a topic that before I went to medical school and became a doctor, people talk about it a lot. It pops up periodically in the media. But I think an interesting topic to be talking about, just by way of personal research. Recently, I asked the cleverest person I know, my wife, that is, about her immediate reaction to creatine. And she said, it's for gym buddies, it's a waste of time. And I think that's a view that I kind of shared as well. But it's been really interesting looking into this. And actually, my views have really changed. How about you? Have you tried creatine? What were your thoughts coming into this to start off with?
Yeah, I have taken this a lot. I remember taking this. I was taking this at school. And I remember thinking, I think I kind of kept it hidden in one of my cupboards, thinking, do not let my mum see this. Like, I'm taking steroids. She can't possibly find this. But it's very cheap. It's very accessible, isn't it? It's a food supplement that anyone can buy. Yeah, I certainly thought I was cheating the system and trying to get feebly big muscles as a 16-year-old or something. And of course, that creatine might be the answer.
Yeah, so we're gonna look at the muscle growth side of things and the gym training and the efficacy or not with creatine with regards to that. But we've also got an interesting angle, I think, today to talk about. That's the new developments in terms of the possible effects of creatine with cognitive effects and actually, interestingly, a role potentially in mental health. We'll also have a look at the safety profile because I know that can be quite controversial, and that's actually an area doing this that I've it's been a bit of an eye-opener for me. So Matt, do you want to just explain to our listeners a little bit about creatine? What is it? And talk a little bit about what the physiology is.
Yep, of course. So I can start with the basics. Creatine, this is a naturally occurring compound that's found in small amounts of certain foods. It's also actually produced by the body. It's primarily produced in the liver. It's stored mainly in the muscles. I think it's about 90 to 95% is stored in the muscles, where it plays a crucial role in energy production. Well, when we talk about energy production, this is particularly this high intensity kind of explosive power. That is when this creatine can actually become really useful. So it's made from 3 amino acids: glycine, arginine, and methionine. It's found in meat and seafood, and I think the word crea actually comes from meat. It's particularly found in beef, pork, salmon. The body can produce about 1 to 2 grams daily by itself. But to give you a bit of an idea, 1 kilogram of beef, I did look up, 1 kilogram of beef or salmon is approximately about 5 grams of creatine. And that's relevant because when you're supplementing it, typically a scoop of creatine in the supplement is about 5 grams. So the supplementation is a huge dose. You wouldn't be able to eat that amount just by eating things like beef and salmon. You know, we're talking a kilogram of beef, for example. It is most commonly creatine monohydrate. I'm aware there's lots of other products on the market, lots of fancy terms as well that will try and get people to spend a bit more money on certain things. But the creatine monohydrate is what we're talking about. So what dietary creatine can provide is when it's absorbed, it turns into this molecule called phosphocreatine, and this serves as a rapid energy reserve. So we've got this energy source called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and when we're doing high intensity exercise, this is the currency that our muscles use, for example. It's similarly used in the brain as well. When the brain is being really tested or really pushed hard, this is the same energy source that the brain utilizes. And Mike, if you bear with me, I'm going to go along with one of my analogies here, because I think when we talk about energy sources, it's nice to kind of explain the different sources and how they're used. We have different fuels that we use when we're doing different forms of activity or exercise. So it's kind of powerlifting or sprinting. You need this ATP. If you're say sprinting a bit further, your next most available energy source is glucose, and we can use this without breathing. This is called anaerobic glycolysis. If you're going on a marathon run, you're going to need to breathe a lot, and you're using a much less available and a bit harder to break down source of energy. We're then talking about this aerobic respiration, or the aerobic utilization of glucose. After you've depleted your glucose stores, your body is then dependent on fat. And I don't know if you've ever run a marathon. In fact, I know you have run a marathon, Mike. But when you go through the wall, you've burnt through all your glucose. You then have to start using fat, and it's much less efficient and much less available. And you just kind of slow down. You have to slow down because your body can't do it as fast. The reason I've just kind of rattled through that is the reason we need ATP is it only serves for those intense moments of activity, that the powerlifting, the sprinting. You cannot use this to run a marathon. It's like pouring petrol on the fire. It's explosive. It's there. The next thing is kind of paper, then it's wood, then it's coals. It's a bit like saying, trying to cook a barbecue with petrol. It just doesn't work.
I like that analogy, and actually it's worth just bearing in mind the ATP, because we're going to come back to that when we talk about these possible cognitive benefits that a couple of studies have shown particular promise with. In terms of creatine, it's available everywhere. You can go online, order it. You don't need a prescription. There aren't any restrictions on it per se, but it is very much traditionally the reserve of those wanting to build up bulks. It goes kind of hand in hand with people taking protein shakes. They go to the gym. They have their creatine supplements. You mentioned the fact you used it. I did too. I remember back in the day when I played rugby and was sort of vaguely interested in the gym. I remember using creatine and again thinking that I was, an elite athlete doing this, but actually I was never very good at the gym at the best of times. And certainly now when I go to the gym and very sheepishly lift some very, very light weights when everyone around me is going off a different stack, I do wonder whether maybe I should revisit this. It's more commonly been associated with those who want to build muscle, those bodybuilders, those people who want to really optimize those explosive activities, as you say. So look, this kind of leads us on nicely to the crux of this. So we know what creatine is, we know how it's available. Now, does it work? And actually what we're going to do is break this down a little bit further. So we're going to look at particular areas and go through this in a bit of detail. Do you want to kick us off, Matt, in terms of, we've alluded to this already, but in terms of weightlifting and those kind of power activities?
Yeah, I will. And I have looked at the evidence for just not only kind of those explosive activities that I talked about, the kind of weightlifting, sprinting. I also looked at the evidence for, does creatine help with things like endurance sport? I think it's quite unanimously appreciated that there is good quality evidence that creatine is actually quite a beneficial supplement for those doing those explosive forms of exercise. There are multiple meta-analyses that show creatine supplementation can increase maximum strength by between 5 and 15% compared to placebo. That's huge, isn't it? If you can get 5 to 15%, so Mike, when you're going back to the gym and you're stood next to someone who's, like you said, lifting a different stack, if creatine is actually going to be giving you an extra somewhere around 10%, it's quite enticing, isn't it? Studies have consistently demonstrated that there is an improved power output during resistance exercises. Now, this is particularly in the 1 to 10 rep range, so I think about 10 reps is my limit on anything typically, but what that's referring to is, if someone's doing the bench press, we're not talking about 40, 50 reps here, we're talking about heavy lifting and again, that explosive power lifting.
In terms of the actual way in which that works, as far as I understand, what creatine essentially does on a simplistic level is it draws fluid into the muscle cells. It does cause a bit of water retention. It's why if you start using creatine, you'll notice you put on a bit of weight in the first few weeks because there's that fluid retention. And what that does, as far as I can tell, is it enhances the power that you have in those muscle cells, which means you can lift more weights and therefore gain muscle mass on that basis. So if you would just take your creatine shakes and do nothing else, you might look a little bit bulkier, but that will just be down to water retention. So there is, I think, a little bit of enhancement of the muscle cell signaling for protein synthesis. It potentially activates these satellite cells, which can help with muscle repair and growth. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, I think the primary reason is this abundance or faster replenishment of ATP. Muscle, when your type 2 fibers are really trying to shift that stack, having that extra availability of that explosive fuel source can allow you to just push it harder, and the more the muscle cells that are damaged by the process of lifting those weights, those cell signals are then really firing off. You've lifted 10 reps rather than 8. You've really shredded the muscle cells, and then the body gets an extra 20% in terms of repairing them. And yes, it does put water into the cells, and there's good evidence to show that extra water in the muscle cells allows them to function better as well. So moving on just briefly to compare and contrast that to endurance sports. When we talk about endurance sports, we're talking about marathon runners, triathlon runners. There isn't really much in the way of benefit for those who are purely doing endurance. So if it is just a slow slog, so if you're doing a marathon, there isn't really much evidence that this will make you faster or less injured. However, there is some evidence to show that if that endurance type of sport does have some component of interval training or a sprint finish, for example, then creatine can actually be helpful for those specific moments in the sport. Certainly, I'm aware that triathletes, for example, in the off season are actually lifting some weights as well. They're trying to build up that muscle mass to prevent your legs getting injured. Having that extra padding and cladding for the on season is actually helpful. There is also a role for these people who are doing endurance sports, but it's less clear. It's less well defined.
Yeah, I think that really chimes with probably my preconceived ideas of this, although the efficacy was better than I thought it was. I was coming in with these preconceived ideas of it being maybe marginal gains at best. The side of this that really did surprise me that I looked at is moving a little bit away from the sport and looking actually at the evidence for creatine for cognitive performance and working memory. A couple of really interesting points that came out of this. So it does appear that there's some evidence that creatine can improve your working memory and intelligence, specifically in certain circumstances, and that is where you're sleep deprived or in stressed conditions. So there was a study that in 2018, a systematic review looking at positive effects on memory and executive function in those who were fatigued or sleep deprived. Interestingly, that's potentially more effective in those who are vegetarians or vegans. So that may well chime with the fact that they have a lower baseline creatine. Again, there was a study that's a little bit old now. It's done in 2003, but that showed that creatine improved IQ and working memory in vegetarians. So there's some interesting stuff here, just in terms of actually creatine's effect beyond purely helping with muscles. The other side of this is mental health. Albeit a small study, there was a study done in 2007 that showed that creatine supplementation, and you alluded to this at the start, but this 5 grams a day, so taking that rather than eating your kilo of meat. And if that was used in combination with your antidepressants, so your SSRIs, it actually showed significant improvement in depression scores compared to placebo. Furthermore, the study suggested that creatine could enhance the effectiveness of SSRIs, especially in women. And it was actually women who seemed to experience more significant benefits from the combination. Now, people have postulated as to why that might be. The hypothesis essentially is that women have lower baseline levels of phosphocreatine in the brain and therefore may benefit more from creatine's ability to increase those energy stores in the brain cells, so that ATP that you discussed. And I think particularly when we think of depression as a multi-domain illness, it's particularly noticed that increased brain energy availability could reduce that mental fatigue in particular. So 2017, they did a meta-analysis of a few small studies and found that creatine had a modest effect on depression symptoms, was particularly effective in patients with major depressive disorder, and particularly it seems to be an augmentation of their current antidepressants. So it's not so much that taking creatine on its own is going to have that much of an effect upon someone with depression, but augmenting their current medication, there may be something here. Again, that meta-analysis showed that women seem to benefit more. The feeling was this was potentially due to hormonal factors that influence brain energy metabolism, and again, creatine's effect on cognitive function.
I've had a look at these as well. Would it be fair to say that a lot of these studies are quite small studies? I mean, I looked at that one about sleep deprivation, and I think it was about only 30 participants. There is also some really interesting studies that aren't just looking at testing someone's memory. They've spent some money scanning people's brains. This was done in the States, where they looked at extent of someone's depression, so how severe versus moderate, and then they scanned their brains. They actually found that those with higher levels of phosphocreatine had less severe symptoms, and there was a significant correlation. And I'll caveat that specific study by saying I think there's a correlation there. They're not kind of confirming any causation. I think there's a number of reasons why those who are more depressed might have lower levels of phosphocreatine in their brain. Socioeconomic status, for one. There's lots of reasons why someone might be eating more salmon, might be less depressed than someone who's eating less, for example. But I think it's really interesting. I think you've given a nice roundup of some of those potential benefits. And I was kind of figure out why this hasn't been better studied. If if this is so promising, why aren't we kind of banging the drum a bit more about this? And I've realised that actually this is such a cheap substance, isn't it? And rather upsettingly or depressingly, this is not something that Big Pharma is going to sponsor to come and do huge randomised controlled trials to prove its effectiveness, because it's just something we can't sell, or they can't sell.
Yeah, that thought crossed my mind exactly. If creatine was a drug that was on patent, it may well be that there were many more studies really interrogating whether these small effective studies were the case. And it's likely, or it's potentially the case, that we won't get those bigger studies. And you're exactly right. We should caveat that by saying that this evidence is based on fairly limited research. The other area that I've looked at that I found really interesting, and the reason for that is both you, Matt, and myself work in the field of concussion. And this is some studies that have been looked at in animals. So the human studies are not quite there yet, but looking at the effect of creatine post-traumatic brain injury. The reason I found this particularly interesting is listening to various talks, talking to experts in the field. A few people have mentioned it. I've had clinic letters from neurologists who have advised patients to be taking creatine post head injury and concussion.
Wow.
And really, as we said, those animal studies really do suggest that creatine supplementation could potentially reduce neuronal damage after a traumatic brain injury. So they've shown that creatine can help preserve brain cells. So I'm constantly explaining this to patients, but what we see is after that initial insult, you get a massive dip in ATP production in the brain. It can take a few days to start to pick up, and that's often why we see after someone's had a head injury that's led to a concussion, we can see that profound fatigue the evening of the injury, and the first few days they feel exhausted, and that's often due to a depletion of ATP in the brain. So it stands to reason that actually if something like creatine that could cross the blood-brain barrier and improve ATP levels, the theory is there in terms of this potentially being useful. Again, these animal studies, they showed that there was potentially reduced brain swelling, improved recovery times in animals that were given creatine post-injury. They have done, I think, some small human studies. 2012 study showed promising results with athletes who took creatine after a concussion, and they experienced fewer cognitive impairments and better recovery compared to placebo. However, as I said, the human studies are really in those early stages, and whilst the data is promising, it's not yet conclusive. So, I haven't been recommending to patients that they take creatine. The evidence isn't there yet, but it's an interesting one to keep an eye on, because to me that feels like a potentially exciting addition to our toolbox in terms of how we manage people who are suffering from the effects of a concussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So just concluding that specific thing about brain health and brain function, I was trying to find if there's any evidence to suggest that creatine might slow the aging process, and everyone's talking about longevity at the moment, aren't they? There are some interesting studies which show creatine supplementation may improve memory and attention in healthy elderly adults. There is some objective improvement in things like spatial recall, long-term memory tasks, with elderly patients who are taking creatine versus placebo. But again, these are small studies. There's only 32 patients in this whole study, and they only actually studied them for 2 weeks. So I think I couldn't really find much on whether creatine actually prevents the aging process. It may stimulate and may provide more fuel for your brain when it's being supplemented, but there isn't any evidence that it actually slows the aging process and wards off dementia, for example.
Yeah, one to keep an eye on, perhaps. I wanted to move on to risks because I found this really interesting, because creatine, to me, ever since I first came across it as a teenager, people were saying to me, don't take creatine, it'll ruin your kidneys. And it's something that I've certainly said as a doctor, maybe not in those words, but have said creatine use, it can affect your kidneys, and talked about a lot of other side effects. So it's really interesting to see that actually that the evidence doesn't stack up with that, as far as I could tell. That the advice seems to be that there's no evidence that conclusively says that creatine has any effect upon your kidneys. The feeling is it probably shouldn't be using it if you have a pre-existing kidney disorder, but if you are healthy and you have fully functioning kidneys, this shouldn't really be an issue.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that, because I was trying to find out what the distinction was, and I think you're right. It's those with pre-existing, say, kidney failure. I think it's to do with this fluid balance and the stress that extra fluid in the body can put on the kidneys when they're trying to get when they're struggling so much to get rid of fluid and maintain that balance, because creatine can, in the first week, can make you put on 1 to 2% of body weight in water. So that is certainly something that I think people with pre-existing kidney conditions should try and avoid. So I certainly wouldn't be recommending it in that situation. Interestingly, just to touch on about kidney disease as well, I've definitely had a few patients in the emergency room where I've thought, oh no, your kidneys are really struggling because of the blood test that we do in hospitals or the GP surgery. Testing your specific kidney markers can be abnormally changed if someone is supplementing with creatine. So if they go in and, if you don't tell your doctor you're taking this, then they can certainly be like, whoa, goodness me, your kidney function is quite poor. But that's actually just a reflection of this extra supplementation artificially altering that kidney test that we do.
I think it is worth mentioning, whilst on the topic of risks or side effects, there's gastrointestinal upset that can potentially happen, a little bit of diarrhea, nausea, that kind of thing. I guess common with many supplementations. I don't know if you, in your research, came up with any other risks or side effects. The one that did occur to me was a more abstract risk, and it was potentially looking more at the societal implications of really just that gym obsession. It's not directly a risk related to creatine, but I do feel as though there's something about the obsession with getting muscly, by getting big, by going to the gym. Does that play into that? I guess, this is potentially stepping out from the realm of medicine and thinking more about more holistic concerns, but that was one that crossed my mind.
Yeah, I think in a similar vein to that, we can study, from our podcast, we're learning about all of these health and wellness trends, and I think there can be wellness fatigue, can't there? And I think if we're all of a sudden promoting creatine as another supplement that everyone should be taking, then these things can create kind of wellness anxiety almost, can't they? As in, like, oh my goodness, I should be taking this, that and everything, and going to the gym 3 times a week and sleeping, and it plays into that, doesn't it? But in terms of other risks, I haven't really found much, and I have to say I'm pretty blown away by the lack of evidence of any real risk. I think there's a few unknowns here, but there's similarly, like there are with everything else, like, the side effects. It hasn't been studied long term. Is it causing any problems long term? Maybe. The special populations, so those who are breastfeeding or pregnant, or even children and adolescents, it's just not been studied. We don't know if it's safe. So I think it's more of an unknown as opposed to an actual risk.
That leads me on to where I really wanted to end this episode, and that was to ask you, Matt, have you read this thinking, you know what, I'm going to have a look at this again, or is it one you're going to pass on?
Mike, I've already ordered some. I ordered some yesterday. I have ordered myself some creatine monohydrate already. I have looked at this and I have jumped in with both feet. I think I'm not planning on getting big muscles, but my sleep-deprived aging brain is certainly keen on boosting itself further. And I think this idea of, particularly in sleep deprivation, if you can turn up to work and if you can boost cognitive performance for those 6 hours, and interestingly of note, I specifically read it was about 8 hours after ingestion, that's when the effect was felt, so almost you need to kind of take it before you go to bed. But yes, I am keen on giving this a try, and I'll certainly be feeding back. I think the risk-benefit ratio here is pretty small. I think we've looked at the risks. I think there aren't really much that we're jumping onto. If there is a 5% benefit, great. Then I'm all ears.
How are you going to fit that into your day, though? With you starting with a cold shower, putting your retinol on your face, taking your vitamin D, and then zapping your brain with electricity. How's the creatine going to fit into that?
Whilst I spent all night under a red light. Look, I think I could find a way of getting that into my day. I think glugging back a potion of creatine is doable. I would like to touch on, in terms of closing thoughts, though. So yes, I'm considering it. One thing I just want to emphasise before I pass the mic back to you is that I think it should be emphasised that there is a hierarchy of importance here, and I think by us proclaiming that creatine is a great supplement everyone should be taking, we're certainly not saying that, we're just open to that idea. I think the idea of using this as an excuse to not go to the gym or not look after yourself or eat a load of crap because creatine might be giving you that extra boost, I think this is quite low down on the hierarchy of importance, and I think there's lots of things that go above that, but it's certainly a compelling supplement, I have to say. What are your closing thoughts, Mike?
Yeah, I think it's actually you've led me into that quite nicely with that comment, because I think that's exactly it. If it was put in front of me, I probably wouldn't have an issue taking it. It might even make me use my gym subscription and go more than once a month because I'd feel compelled to do so. But I think you're exactly right in that kind of hierarchical nature of what's required. There's probably quite significant things I should be doing better before I get down to using creatine. But that's more just my own ineptitude and lack of organisation skills. I think it is something that is interesting. I'm really interested, not so much for my own personal use, but I'm really interested to hear what happens in terms of the concussion side of things, potentially also with with the role in mental health. Although, as we know, it may be that those really good quality studies don't materialise, but it's one that I'll be interested to keep an eye on. And as I said, it was a little bit of an eye opener. I was very much sharing in the view that this was essentially a bit of a waste of time before looking into this. So I'm glad we've done this. I felt like I've learned something. If it can make me a little bit less embarrassed when I'm doing my weight sessions at the gym, then maybe it is worth giving it a go.
Perfect. To any of those listeners who've made it this far in this episode, congratulations. That is well done. Please do give us a review, write us a review, or follow the podcast. We've been getting some lovely feedback and some momentum growing, so thank you so much for that. And tune in for next week.
Cheers, Matt.